artists. For this series, we are going to be talking about dancers, but more specifically, dancers that dance in heels. So from the work that I've done, I've noticed that there's a big difference in some of the issues that come up for dancers that dance barefoot or with a flat foot. Dancers that dance in relevé, meaning their heels are lifted, and dancers that dance with their heels lifted but supported by a heel. So here is a foot, and we're going to pretend that it's being lifted by a heel. So first, the ankle joint needs to flex back a little bit. And then these joints here need to spread down, and then the toes curl up, and that's how we can support ourselves onto a heel. The last part that happens is that then these little toes curl to claw to keep balance on that surface. Okay, so now that we see what's happening with the bones when our foot is in a heel, let's talk about the muscles. So if our foot is in a heel, meaning that our ankle is pointing down and our feet are down, then you can imagine that the calf muscles here are going to be in a shortened, tightened position, and the front muscles of the foot are going to be in a little bit more of an elongated position when we're looking at this area here around the ankle. But then when we look at the rest of the foot, then you could see that from this position to this position to being in a heel, then the bottom part of the foot is shortened and this is elongated, but at the end the toes have to curl up, and so then the area here of the foot becomes very tight here and overstretched in this area. Okay, so now that we've talked about the flexion that happens at the ankle and at the foot and the extension that happens at the toes, I want you to imagine that the only time in nature that you would find yourself in this position with your foot is, for example, if you were going downhill. So imagine yourself on the side of a mountain, facing downhill with your heel higher than your toes, and then you can see why your body then reacts by gripping the tiny little toes, which then creates the ever-dreaded hammer toe or claw foot in these toes, because your body thinks it's falling downhill, and so the very last thing it tries to do to save you from falling on your face is gripping with the toes to help you with your balance if you don't have the strength in the rest of your foot and up the leg to keep you from falling forward. So now let's look at what happens to Paloma, our skeleton, when we put her into a heel. So this is our heel, and as soon as I lift her heel, there has to be a reaction from the bones up the chain. So the first thing that happens is that her knee bends. This automatically creates more stress at the knee and engages the quads more. The next thing that happens is that the pelvis angles and tips forward so that the abdominals become elongated, and the glutes also become elongated here, creating tightness in the low back and tightness. So, because now we understand how the effects of using heels affects the skeleton, we can kind of have a little bit more of an understanding of why we're going to be doing some of the soft tissue work that we're going to be doing, and then some of the stretching and strengthening. So we're going to be trying to counterbalance once we're up on the heels and we have a lot of extra work on the quads, and we have an elongation of the abdominals and of the glutes, but a shortness of the hip flexors and the low back. We're going to be trying to reverse some of that with the work that we're doing so that we're engaging in the glutes more, engaging more in the core, and stretching here. So first, we're going to start with lacrosse ball rolling the bottom of the foot. So I usually will start with supporting my heel and then just kind of windshield wipering my foot side to side. I'm looking for hot spots. I'm looking for areas that are sore. Basically just treasure hunting for areas that need some time and attention. Then I'll work more towards the middle part of my foot. Windshield wiper there again. And I can also put the ball of my foot down and then lacrosse ball roll the bottom. If all of that is feeling pretty good, then I can roll through and do kind of longer sweeping strokes. Or if I find a spot that's really kind of tender, I can micro roll there. Or I can just apply pressure and allow the tissue to kind of ease around the ball to normalize the tissue. Next, we're going to use the lacrosse ball on a raised surface to massage these tight areas of the calf. So you want to make sure that the ball is raised on something, otherwise you won't get the pressure that you need to work on these muscles. The place where I'm placing the ball is just on the inside, not directly on the Achilles, in that little soft spot there. And then you can either just allow the weight of your body to drape around the ball, or you can roll through, do little micro rolling to start releasing the tissue. If you find a spot that feels particularly tight, you can pause on that or just do tiny little rolls. And you can work that all the way up and down your calf on any spots that feel particularly tight. And now we are foam rolling the quad. So you have your foam roller mid-thigh, and you can start rolling towards your knee and towards your hip. Basically, the first few times that you're rolling through, you're just looking to see what areas need some attention. And then you can either just pause on an area to let the tissue drape around the foam roller, or you can do a little micro rolling to help soften the tissue and normalize around it. The next area is right here by your hip. And a lot of times, if you, it's a much smaller space right where your bone and your leg connect. So if you want to just stop on it, let the tissue soften, and then just do some little micro rolling there, that will help get the hip flexor. So now we're going to stretch the muscles on the top part of the foot. So if you curl your toes under, that's a really great way of stretching them. If this feels like you're putting too much pressure on your toes, you can roll up a towel or use a pillow to do it. But make sure that you're staying really on this part of your foot and you're not sickling out that way. The next stretch is going to be for the bottom parts of the toes, and you can come down, sit on your heels to stretch them that way. If that feels like too much pressure on your toes, you can lift off so that it takes a little bit less pressure on them. But when you go down, make sure that this toe stays out and tracking, that it's not in towards the middle. And then from there, you can go ahead and put your knees down. Okay, so to stretch this part of your calves here, you can start with your toes onto the wall. Track your knee over your fourth toe to see if you feel a stretch. If your heel comes off, then this is where you stay, and you only go as far as you can before your heel starts to lift. So if you're going to bring your knee to the wall and it starts to lift there, then this is the range of motion that you work. If you can go a little bit farther away from the wall before your heel lifts, then that is going to be the range that you can use to stretch. So one thing I would like for you to try, in this position, go ahead and let your knee track over your big toe, and you see how much it affects the arch of your foot. Whereas if you track it over your fourth toe, it keeps the integrity of your arch while you're stretching your calf. So once you're there, go ahead and pump through that 10 times. All right, so now the goal of this next stretch is going to be to stretch the whole front part of the ankle. I get a lot of complaints from a lot of people that are trying to stretch this area and they can never really quite get in there to get that stretching. So if you have something that you can place your knee on, this will help us stretch into the ankle. So this is just a wood yoga block. And if you place your knee on there, then your foot can rest and you can push through the ankle to get a stretch here onto that front part of the ankle. Okay, so here we are going to be focusing on stretching the hip flexors in the front. So I'm in this kneeling position, And I want to be pulling my pubic bone up to the ceiling and my tailbone down to the ground. And right away you should feel a pretty big stretch. You want to make sure that your knee, your hip, and your shoulder are stacked right over each other. And then once you feel that stretch on the front part of your quad, then you can just shift yourself maybe an inch forward, and you should feel a pretty big pull onto the top part of your quad and your hip flexors. Some people have a hard time kneeling on the floor in order to stretch their quads and hip flexors, or some people have sensitive knees. And so this is a really nice alternative. You can use a chair. Position yourself so that your leg is leaning against it, and then as you push through, you can get yourself to a position where you can feel the stretch in your quads. Even here though, you still have to pull your pubic bone up to the ceiling and your tailbone down to the ground in order to isolate the stretch into this front part of your quads here. All right, so now we're going to stretch the low back. So go ahead and lay on your back with your arms out to your side. You can cross one leg over the other, and then let that leg guide the twist away from your opposite shoulder. So here, our goal is that your shoulder stays on the floor and your hips only rotate away as much as you can without your shoulder coming off the floor. So if your shoulder does that, it's too far and you need to bring your hips a little bit up until you can keep your shoulder down, and then slowly you can breathe and stretch through so that you can stretch further into your low back. Okay, now that we've done a bunch of mobility and stretching, we are going to start doing some strengthening. So it's always really humbling for me to put my dancer feet on video, but here we go. So I want you to start by trying to fan your toes out as far as you can. So almost picture trying to get your pinky toe as far away from your big toe as possible without trying to go up to do it. So we don't necessarily want flexion of the toes. What we want to try is to just spread them out to the sides as much as you can. And if it's helpful to you, leaving that big toe planted if you can't also fan out the big toe. And you can see here how dancing in shoes for about 15 years for me makes this really challenging, especially in my fourth and fifth toe. But this is a great strengthener. Okay, this next strengthener is for these muscles here that counterbalance. When we dance in shoes, our toe is usually pushed in towards the middle of the foot. And so if we strengthen these outer muscles here, it will help us keep better alignment of this big toe. So the goal using this yoga block here is for me to bring the big toe towards the yoga block using these muscles here and trying to not get as much involvement from these toes here. So if you go ahead and lift the big toe just far enough off of the ground to be able to bring it as close to that yoga mat as you can without twisting your ankle. So it really should all be just movement coming from your big toe, and you'll be able to feel these little muscles working. Okay, so for this next strengthening, we can see that if our foot is in a heeled shoe, the foot can actually rest in that position. If we were in a relevé, the muscles have to be engaged to maintain it. But since we're resting on something, then what can happen is that the arch is more in a position where it can drop that way. So strengthening our arch is really helpful. So after you spread your toes, you can picture the muscles underneath your arch coming around and lifting. And while you can do this exercise just with the muscles of your foot, you can also picture that spiral of tension coming up the whole leg and then wrapping all the way to the glute, so that when you go to lift your arch, you're engaging the whole leg and supporting it with your deep rotators. All right, so this next strengthening exercise, we're going to use a lacrosse ball, and that short foot action that we were using in the previous strengthener. So use a ball and place it between your heels and go ahead and right away lift and engage your arches. From there, drive through your first 3 toes to lift and come down without letting your arches collapse. So keep them engaged, lift, and come down. And the whole time you want to make sure that that spiral is coming up all of your legs and staying engaged, and your pubic bone is moving up to the ceiling and your ribs are moving down towards the floor so that this stays connected as you go up and down, landing in an arch that's lifted so that you can start training the strength. Okay, dancers, this next exercise is going to incorporate many of the things that we've already learned and putting them all together for good stabilization. So spread your toes, lift your arches, and then go into a little bit of a plie here. And the goal, you can hold on to something if you want, is that with a band around your knees, you stabilize the supporting leg and lift this leg back without letting anything move from your arch, your supporting knee, and your core, so that you're reaching back, strengthening the back part of the hip, and also challenging the standing leg to make sure that the arch stays nice and engaged when you're trying to engage or move your other leg. All right, dancers, this next exercise will take the information from the previous one where we were trying to stabilize through the outer part of the hip in order to control the knee movement while maintaining an engaged arch. So you have the band around your knees here. You're going to bend slightly, and you want to make sure that your core stays engaged. So don't stick your tail out, but instead go into basically a small plie and a hip hinge, and then keep, no matter what you're doing, keep this engagement the same. So when you're here, you want to open twice as wide and then close right underneath so that you're at the same width as your hips. So open twice as wide and then close right underneath you. The challenge is to make sure that when you put your foot down, you have the engagement in your arch. Hi dancers, let's talk about glute strength. So here we're going to be doing a bridge. So you lay flat on your back. Your ankles and your knees are the same width as your hips. And you make sure that your ribs are connected to the top part of your pelvis. And what we're going to do is that we're going to move this whole trunk area up using the glutes as one single unit. So for this variation of the bridge, we're not going to roll down each individual vertebra. Instead, we're going to move the whole trunk up and down. You can picture either pushing up through your hip creases, or you can feel with your hands the engagement of the glutes pushing your pelvis up. All right, dancers, so we just did bridge for your glute strength, but as dancers, we move around a lot, so we need to have our glutes be strong on multiple planes. So if you stand on one leg, the important thing is that you maintain your arch, and then go ahead and bend forward, soften the knee a little bit, come all the way down, open, come back, and bring yourself back up. You can repeat that multiple times. The most important thing is that your arch stays controlled and lifted while you hinge forward and back.